I've been invited to address three topics in my remarks. The first is to provide an overview of how Canada's immigration system works. So I'm going to try to do my best to walk you through about 160 years of history in 2 to 3 minutes. I'll then explain how our immigration system supports regional economic development and helps to support the goal of addressing labor shortages. And then third, I want to talk more about how we can promote immigration in Eastern Ontario. And my remarks here will be an extension of the remarks that Jody provided, referring to the great strategy that stakeholders in Eastern Ontario have prepared. And I want to touch on some additional suggestions that I have that can support our objectives of attracting and retaining more newcomers in Eastern Ontario moving forward. And then hopefully we'll have the opportunity for ample Q&A at the end of my presentation. So when we look at how Canada's immigration system works, we want to start off with the Constitution Act of 1867. Upon Canada's founding back then, immigration was outlined as an area of shared federal provincial jurisdiction along with agriculture. And in fact, with these two areas, old age security was the only other policy area formally outlined in our Constitution as areas of shared jurisdiction. This goes to show you just how important Canada's founders saw immigration to building this country, both economically as well as socially. Although the Constitution notes that immigration is an area of shared jurisdiction, it's very clear, there's no debate about this whatsoever. The federal government has the upper hand in terms of shaping Canada's immigration policies. Now, explaining why, or to help us understand why immigration was seen as so vital back then, we have to remember that at the time, Canada was a sparsely populated country. We had a rural and agrarian economy. And so both the federal and provincial governments saw immigration as absolutely key to getting newcomers to populate our farms so that we can fuel Canada's economic growth. At the time as well, the 4 founding provinces of Canada had a lot of experience in terms of attracting and settling newcomers leading up to Canada's founding. And immigration was so important back then that the year after Canada's founding, there was a national conference held in Ottawa where the Prime Minister as well as his counterparts met to explore how they can promote the new country's immigration objectives. Now, with all that being said, after all those remarks, for the next 100 years, the federal government dominated our immigration system. And there are a variety of reasons for this. One of which was the federal government wanted more control so that they can support the objective of promoting immigration to the prairie provinces. But there are also global factors that caused Canada's immigrant intake to plummet, such as the 2 Great Wars and the Great Depression. Then, after the Second World War ended, we had this thing called the baby boom. And with the average Canadian family having 4 or more kids, there wasn't really a need for the federal government as well as the provinces to be as aggressive on the immigration front as we are today, when our birth rate is about 1.4 to 1.5 births per family. Now, provincial involvement in immigration really ramped up in the 1960s in conjunction with the Quiet Revolution in Quebec. As the province was experiencing significant socio and economic change, it came to the realization that its demographic, economic, and political weight in Canada would wane if the province wasn't able to identify how to promote its population growth. And at that time, its birth rate was already beginning to fall. And so the province was actually very astute in recognizing immigration as a tool to support its demographic, economic, and political weight in Canada. And so Quebec was really a pioneer in this regard. And essentially, their view on the importance of immigration in the 1960s eventually translated to the rest of the provinces. Now, if we fast forward to more recent times in the 1990s, what I just described in Quebec was the sentiment experienced in smaller provinces across Canada in the mid-1990s. Interestingly, Manitoba was one of the pioneers in terms of provincial involvement in immigration at this time. And a major reason as to why the province became so interested in getting more involved in immigration is in the mid-1990s, they lost their beloved NHL team, the Winnipeg Jets. And so this was a real turning point for the business community in Winnipeg and across Manitoba to basically look for solutions on how the province can do a better job of supporting its population growth. So Manitoba, other provinces were early adopters of the provincial nominee program. Essentially what it is it allows the provinces to determine selection criteria of economic class immigrants that can support their labor force needs. Once a province nominates an immigrant, that person can then submit their permanent residence application to the federal government. And today, pretty much every province and territory, with the exceptions of Nunavut, which doesn't really engage in the immigration system, and Quebec, which has its own system, operate the provincial nominee program. Now, in terms of how the immigration system works today, as I noted at the outset, under the Constitution, federal government has the upper hand in terms of managing the immigration system. Even when it comes to Quebec, only the federal government has the ability to either accept someone's application to enter Canada or to reject them. The federal government shapes our immigration targets nationally. Of course, it consults with the provinces, but ultimately it determines what it feels is the appropriate level to support Canada's various economic, familial, as well as humanitarian objectives. The federal government also shapes immigration programs of its own on the economic side with its express entry system, as well as other programs such as the Atlantic Immigration Program. It's responsible for family class reunification, welcoming refugees, citizenship, and of particular interest to this group, they provide by far the most funding to Canada's settlement program. IRCC spends about $2 billion annually now on settlement programs across Canada and in Quebec. And these are programs obviously designed to support the success of newcomers in their early years of landing in Canada. Quebec is the only province with the ability to go to the federal government and say, these are the number of immigrants we would like to welcome next year. This was a privilege it was able to negotiate as part of the last immigration agreement that it signed with the federal government, which remains in effect to this day. That agreement, called the Canada-Quebec Accord for short, was signed in 1991. Quebec, also unlike other provinces and territories, has full control in terms of its economic class program. So basically, if you are looking to apply to a federal program, you can go to any province and territory in Canada, except for Quebec. This is with respect to the economic class. Quebec also has more influence than other provinces and territories in terms of its family class, as well as refugee class admissions. And unlike the rest of the provinces and territories, any settlement funding that the Quebec government gets from the federal government, the Quebec government has sole authority and complete autonomy in terms of what it wants to do with that money. With every other province and territory, the contribution agreements are negotiated between the federal government and settlement organizations, and these settlement organizations need to report back to IRCC in terms of the use of the money as well as the results of how they've used IRCC funding. The provinces and territories, as I've noted, are able to shape and operate their provincial nominee programs. They're also able to complement IRCC-funded settlement services by funding services of their own. And the provinces, again, this is their constitutional prerogative, have the ability to come up with dedicated immigration laws, as well as to govern in other areas, other policy areas, which impact newcomers themselves. So areas such as health, education, infrastructure, labor laws, you name it. And Ontario is actually one of the very few provinces in Canada with its own dedicated Immigration Act, which the province passed and enacted prior to the pandemic. I'm jumping the gun a bit, but I'll touch on this now. In terms of connecting the Constitution to Canada's current immigration realities, back in 1867, because of the structure of our economy and society, the two major and influential levels of government were the federal and provincial governments. Most Canadians, or most people in Canada at that time, settled on farms and in rural communities. Today, however, the vast majority of us live in municipalities. And so one of the shortcomings of our constitutional structure today is that municipalities don't have a formal role in our immigration system. And this is a challenge that we continue to face. They have more of an ad hoc role, even though they are arguably the most prominent players today in terms of most prominent government players today in terms of supporting the success of newcomers after they have physically landed in Canada. Now, just to underscore how prominent the provincial nominee program is, as of last year, 2022, it was the first time in our immigration system's history that the PNP now accounts for the majority of economic class immigrants that are admitted into Canada. It started as a very small and niche program with just 400 new immigrants coming to Canada in its first full year of operations in 1999. We can now see that the target is well over 100,000 new immigrants that will be arriving through the PNP each year moving forward. And this is very important when it comes to a discussion on regional economic development as well as supporting labor shortages. And that is because Canada's history shows if you don't give smaller jurisdictions the ability to shape their selection criteria and to identify newcomers they feel can support their labor force needs, it becomes very difficult for those communities to be able to attract immigrants. And so this is something that I'm going to want to touch on later on, just how important the PNP will be moving forward to supporting our objective of attracting and retaining more immigrants in Eastern Ontario. Moving forward, the PNP is going to play a more prominent role in Ontario's immigration system. Earlier this year, Ontario negotiated a new deal with the federal government. Moving forward by 2025, the Ontario government will be able to nominate 18,000 immigrants under its provincial nominee program. This represents a doubling, roughly a doubling of the current allocation, And so what this means is Ontario is going to have more ability in the years to come to promote immigration to smaller and medium-sized communities. Now, when I spoke a bit about the cons with respect to the loophole on the municipal front. I'll speak a bit more on the pros, and I will touch on additional cons in a second. One of the big benefits of our current immigration system is with the federal government playing the lead role. We do have a lot of consistency nationally in terms of how we operate the system with respect to the criteria of programs, as well as on the settlement front. With IRCC playing such a large role in terms of settlement funding, we're able to have consistency in terms of the types of programs and the quality of programs and services that newcomers receive when it comes to settlement. We also have a very diverse immigration system reflective of our diversity as a country, regionally, economically, and culturally. It's important to give autonomy to provinces as well as the smaller jurisdictions to achieve their various goals. And this is very important in terms of preserving Canada's Francophone character. And as I'll speak to more in a second, it's also very important to give jurisdictions the ability to select economic class immigrants to address their labor force needs. Just because they're closer to the ground and they have a better idea of where their needs are. And also, this is absolutely vital. And again, we'll see this in a second in terms of promoting a more equitable distribution of immigration across the country. At the time of the PNP's launch in the mid-90s, this was actually a high. This was more of the exception rather than the rule. There was a point where 85% of all immigrants coming to Canada went to just 3 provinces, Ontario, BC, and Quebec. The norm was actually in the low 80s, but still it was very, very high. We've got this down to the high 60s. Most recently in 2022, it fell to 72% of immigrants going to these 3 provinces. And so not only have we seen about a 10-point decline in terms of immigration to the 3 provinces, but the decline has also come over a period where Canada has doubled its immigration levels. And so what this means is that we've been able to share the benefits of immigration more equitably across the country, thanks to initiatives such as the Provincial Nominee Program and more recently, the Atlantic Immigration Program. Many of you may have seen last week, Statistics Canada released an update on its population figures for Canada. Canada, over the last year, has enjoyed a national population growth rate of 3%. Almost 100% of this population growth is from international migration. And this captures not only permanent residents, but also temporary residents, such as international students and foreign workers. And we're seeing a positive story for the most part across the country. I mean, Ontario has obviously long been a have on the immigration front, but also we want to see other provinces and territories also benefit from immigration so that they can enjoy economic as well as social benefits by welcoming newcomers. However, there's still a really big challenge when it comes to regionalization, and I'll speak to this in a moment. Touching, again, extending on the discussion of the pros of our immigration system, one of the benefits of having so many options for economic class immigrants is that they're basically able to identify pathways that can give them more flexibility to pursue immigration to this country. Previously, it was more binary in the sense that there were fewer programs available. And so if you didn't meet the requirements of the handful of programs, you were pretty much shut out. Now we have so many doors available which allows us to welcome people with more diverse backgrounds. I mean, basically, you want to operate an immigration system similar to, for instance, your operations in your current work environment. You want to bring in people with complementary skill sets. It's not going to work if, for instance, all the people you're bringing in have similar backgrounds, right? You need people that are strong in finance, people strong in marketing, people strong in policy, et cetera, et cetera. What we're also looking to do more of, both nationally as well as at the regional level, is we want to balance out our immigration system between selecting people who have very high human capital, while at the same time also selecting people based on their ability to address specific needs. And this is something that we've struggled with historically. We previously had a long-standing model where you needed to fit an occupational background to immigrate to Canada. We then shifted to say, as long as you have high levels of English or French language proficiency and high levels of education and a lot of work experience will bring you in, to now saying we want both. We want people that meet our occupational needs. And at the same time, we also want people who have high human capital. And at the end of the day, by having this balanced approach, we're confident we are going to be able to address our broad economic needs. Here in Ontario, you can see the diversity of the province's provincial nominee program. This is an overview of all the people that they nominated back in 2022. It was almost 10,000 people that they nominated. And you can see the variety of different streams and people of different backgrounds. So we're looking to bring in people who address specific labor shortages with our in-demand skills stream. We also allow foreign workers and international students who have a job offer to remain in the province. If you don't have a job offer, but you have high levels of education, so you completed a master's or a doctoral degree in the province, we want you as well. If you have a trades background, we'll look to nominate you, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, we're looking to strengthen the Francophone character of our province as well by nominating French candidates. Now, I've touched a bit on the cons. I'll elaborate a bit more. The over 100 different economic class pathways is very dizzying for all stakeholders, whether you're an expert that's immersed in the space or the end user and a newcomer yourself. It's very challenging in terms of identifying which options may be best for you. We're all aware of the credentialing challenges. This is historically been a negative story. However, if we have the opportunity in the Q&A, I can elaborate. Credentialing and newcomer integration into the labor market has improved in recent years, and I do expect it to continue to improve. There is an argument we hear occasionally that IRCC funding to Quebec on the settlement front is disproportionate to the rest of the country. I did a back of a napkin calculation a couple of years ago, and my numbers are that Quebec gets about $13,000 annually per immigrant versus about $3,000 annually per immigrant in every other province and territory across the country. I've touched on the ad hoc role of municipalities. This is a function of two areas, of two issues. One is the Constitution, which I don't see to be that big of a barrier. The main inhibitor is a lack of federal and provincial will to get the municipalities more formally involved in our immigration system. We've heard a lot of excuses here, but really there's no excuse in terms of not getting municipalities at the table to help better shape the future of our immigration system. And I want to elaborate on this point a bit further. I touched on it moments ago. We've been very successful in terms of promoting a more equitable distribution of immigration across Canada. However, we're still struggling to figure out how we can promote a more equitable distribution within our provinces and territories. Without fail, In every single province and territory in Canada, 80% of immigrants to a given province or territory will go to the main cities. And again, there's no exception to this in across the country. We've seen this decline somewhat in recent times here in Ontario. However, it remains to be seen as to whether this decline is due to policy or whether this decline has been due to the pandemic. The GTA, the Greater Toronto Area, comprises roughly half of Ontario's population. And so, in theory, the proportionate amount of newcomers that should be heading to the GTA is about 50% of the newcomers that are welcomed by Ontario. However, again, in recent years, it's been 80%. It's gone down to 70%. However, I'm still not sure whether this decline has been because of policies pursued by IRCC during the pandemic that have looked to transition more temporary residents to permanent residents because of the border closures and other COVID-related disruptions that resulted in us looking more inward because of the difficulties of welcoming newcomers from overseas. At this juncture, what this means is that 50% of Ontario, including in communities in Eastern Ontario, are vying for just 30% of newcomers in this province. This is a significant imbalance and one that we aren't going to be able to afford moving forward. Now, I want to touch on the recommendations in the excellent Eastern Ontario immigration strategy and complement the remarks that Jody made at the outset of this event. The first recommendation I want to provide, and this is by far the most important one, is communities like Eastern Ontario have to apply significant amounts of pressure on governments in order to be able to benefit from immigration. The rule in Canada's immigration system is if you don't ask, you don't get, right? And we've seen this with the provincial nominee program. Smaller provinces like Manitoba and New Brunswick and Atlantic Canada, et cetera, they really had to knock on the door of Ottawa to have the ability to select immigrants under the PNP. And more recently, the Ontario government did the same thing by knocking on the door of Ottawa and saying, the 9,000 to 10,000 immigrants we nominate each year isn't enough, we need it doubled, and lo and behold, they got it doubled. And so regions like Eastern Ontario have to communicate loud and clear to the Ontario government. The imbalance that I just spoke to is not in the province's best interests. The province needs to do more in terms of promoting a more equitable distribution of immigration across Ontario. This is the province's mandate, and they can't just pay lip service to it. I did a study prior to the pandemic looking at the distribution of immigrants nominated by Ontario. And I found that 80% who were nominated in the Greater Toronto Area. So the province has this amazing tool at its disposal to promote a more equitable distribution of immigration across Ontario. They're not using it effectively, and they really need advocacy from smaller and medium-sized communities so that they can get the message and address this challenge. Second comment is more of a reminder. Oftentimes, stakeholders in smaller communities ask, what is it that we can do to attract and retain more immigrants? Well, we have enjoyed a formula for success across Canada since the mid-1990s. And essentially, it's four points. First is that newcomers are looking for employment. Second, newcomers are looking for a sense of community. That is, they want to feel welcome. They want to ensure that it's a safe society from a social point of view, that there's no xenophobia or there's very little xenophobia. They need supports. They need ESL as well as French language supports. They need local community actors to help them in terms of enrolling their children in school and getting their partner integrated into the labor market, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, they need infrastructure. So one of the key points on infrastructure is, as you can imagine, oftentimes a newcomer will arrive and they won't be able to get around. And so it's very important to have access to public transit as a newcomer so that you can get acclimated in your new home. And so these are 4 points that one often has to keep in mind as they're looking to promote more immigration success in their jurisdiction. One of the things noted in your immigration strategy is the importance of collecting data among the newcomers already in your jurisdiction, and your immigration strategy does an amazing job of this. It's very data rich. I think there's like 30 or 40 pages of data in there. And one of the reasons this is so important is because you don't have to reinvent the wheel in terms of the action that you take after collecting this data. So what you can do by taking a look at it is understand the demographic, economic, and social profiles of the newcomers already in your community, and apply that to your efforts to attract and retain more immigrants moving forward. This data is also very helpful in terms of understanding the challenges that newcomers in your community face, what some of your community shortcomings are, and then using this information to address the shortcomings so that you can provide your existing newcomers and future ones with a better experience. It's also helpful to reach out to the newcomers in your community and ask them to support your recruitment efforts. We've seen this in other parts of Canada. So for instance, we've seen it in New Brunswick. They have communities with significant Colombian populations, and it's through word of mouth that they've been able to support so-called chain migration from various diaspora groups. Your strategy also points out the importance of marketing in conjunction with one another. This is important because, again, we have to think about it from a newcomer's point of view. If you're a newcomer thinking about coming to Canada and someone asks you which cities in Canada have you heard of, they're usually going to tell you, I've heard of Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, maybe Calgary, Halifax, etc. But in terms of our secondary, tertiary, and very small cities, they don't know much. And so it's very important that smaller and medium-sized cities put their best foot forward, market aggressively, so that newcomers are aware of the opportunities in their community. So in the case of a place like Eastern Ontario, for the most part, you're not going to be able to compete with a place like Toronto in terms of the size of its economy, the size of its newcomer population. However, you are able to compete in other ways. So for instance, research shows newcomers who move to smaller communities are highly motivated by the quality of life. They might not want the hustle and bustle of a Toronto or of a Montreal or a Vancouver. They may want a slower pace of life. They may want access to outdoor activities and natural beauty and landscapes and what have you. And so it's very key to highlight this point to newcomers in your marketing efforts. There are, of course, job opportunities. It's just very vital in terms of communicating these opportunities to newcomers. And of course, one of the advantages that Eastern Ontario has is you're able to market to a larger group of newcomers. Because in addition to those who have English backgrounds, you're able to reach out to Francophones, given the Francophone character of the region. This is also pointed out in your strategy. With large employers, it's very easy for them to, or it's easier for them, I should say, to recruit immigrants, as well as to onboard them. With small and medium-sized employers, it's a bit more challenging because oftentimes they're not familiar with the immigration system. So for instance, they don't know whether they're allowed to hire someone on a study permit or a work permit. They also are not aware of the value or the benefits of hiring immigrants, or they have some misconceptions about them. And so facilitating face-to-face networking events tends to be very productive. And oftentimes we hear from these employers, I wasn't expecting that. It was such a great experience. I really want to remain in touch with some of the newcomers that I met and had the privilege of getting to know. Recruitment efforts in the GTA and other parts of Canada can also support immigrant attraction and retention in the region. So poaching newcomers from other parts of the country. A lot of times, international students and foreign workers to a lesser extent are looking for opportunities in other parts of the country. And so given that they're already here, it's lower hanging fruits to connect with them and to offer them job opportunities, as well as the quality of life benefits available to them in communities such as those in Eastern Ontario. And the last suggestion I want to point out, and this is a huge gap in our immigration system, is we have such a large pool of international students and foreign workers who up until now do not have access to IRCC-funded settlement services. This is becoming a growing challenge because more and more of them are transitioning to permanent residence. As of last year, about 1/3 of our new permanent residents transitioned from previous temporary status. And in recent data that I analyzed from Ottawa-Gatineau, I was surprised to find that of these individuals who transition from temporary to permanent residence, there is a significant uptake of them who look for IRCC-funded services. So even years after they've come to Canada on their temporary status, they still need settlement supports. To conclude, your strategy is excellent. It's one of the best, actually, that I've ever seen. Creates a very solid foundation. And remember that strategies such as these are living and breathing documents. You're not going to get everything right. You are going to make mistakes, but that's okay, because this will serve as a foundation in terms of promoting your efforts to attract and retain more immigrants. You'll be able to fine-tune these efforts, and eventually you will be able to enjoy the benefits of immigration that you're looking to achieve. And this isn't a motivational speech. We've seen this in other parts of Canada over the last 30 or so years. And the lesson is basically, if you build it, they will come. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer your questions.
That was absolutely fantastic, Kareem. Thank you so very much for sharing those insights and recommendation, and for really taking us through, like you said, a very long history in a very short period of time. So as we transition into the Q&A portion of our time together, just a couple housekeeping items. To the right of your screen, you will see a feed loop chat window. So we really do encourage you to pop some questions in there. You can also use the Q&A window at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So please feel free to use this feature if you have any comments that you'd like to share with your fellow participants today. And again, if you have any questions for Kareem, please do type them in there. Or you may also have the option to raise your virtual hand and ask your question aloud if we have the time. Okay, so we have our first question for you, Kareem, and this is comes to us from our Q&A window. So from an advocacy perspective, I'm interested to hear about the value of aligning with other similar areas of Ontario to advocate for a range of additional supports to pull newcomers out of Toronto, or as you referred to it as, pilfering them, if you will. And so an example that they provide, there's a great program called Connections Canada. This promotes non-large city centers to new permanent residents for pre-arrival. And we also have another organization who will be also sharing details about that coming up at 2 o'clock. And so banding together to brand across Eastern Ontario, Western Ontario, and North to leverage this initiative. How might strategies like these be picked up by a strategy like the local immigration partnerships, which is very regionalized strategies?
Absolutely. So I'm glad that this question was asked. it carries more weight if communities across Ontario speak with one voice, and not only just go to the provincial government, but also the federal government and say, hey, we need your support. We have the will, we have the welcoming communities, we're collaborating with one another. Collaboration is key from a government point of view as well, because it brings costs down. You have less inefficiencies there, sorry. And basically say, hey, we're ready, willing, and able, right? We just need the tools to make this happen. And I've touched on the provincial government. I want to highlight actually a federal policy promise that has been made that the government has yet to pursue. Prior to the pandemic in 2019, the federal government promised to launch the municipal nominee program. They said that the goal of this would be to help promote immigration to smaller and medium-sized municipalities. Now, to be fair to them, the pandemic happened, right? They were actually planning, they did release on their website some consultation, which people are able to contribute to, and we were able to understand their thinking. They began designing it, and then obviously it had to be put aside because of the pandemic. However, the promise is now becoming long in the tooth, and it is about time that the government come out and deliver on it, so that not only communities in Eastern Ontario, but also across Ontario and across Canada can benefit from this additional tool. There's no magic bullet solution, but what you want is basically to pursue as many tools out there so that eventually you can develop that critical mass of immigration that you're looking to achieve.
So our next question is from Dan Mellon from KI Canada. In 2023, do you think that the LMIA still has merit?
It does have merit from a practical point of view. And I'll provide another practical comment in a second. It has merit in the sense that the vast majority of employers are earnest, have a genuine need to hire workers, and oftentimes what's lost in the discourse, it's actually more painful and expensive for an employer to hire a foreign worker than it is to hire a Canadian, right? It's so much more convenience to find a local Canadian. You don't have to worry about a visa. You don't have to worry about language or culture or their work experience or anything like that, right? However, when there's an absence, employers have to turn to global talent, right? And so it's a painful process. The LMIA makes it very difficult. There's no question about that. But at the same time, the LMIA is meant to offer checks and balances so that Canadian workers are protected. And also that the foreign workers who are brought in are protected, which is a good thing. Can it become simpler? Can it become less onerous on employers? Yes. The government is rolling out a new trusted employer system over the next 3 months, which aims to make it easier. Will it be as easy as all of us want it to be? No. Government has an inability to do that. However, hopefully that is a positive step forward. Now, the other practical points that I'll make, having lived in Ottawa for 5 years and met countless times with IRCC and ESDC, they are so terrified of having one bad news story on the front page of the Globe and Mail about TFW abuse that they will never relinquish they'll never get rid of the LMIA process. They're terrified of just that one bad story that will make the government look awful, right? So it's pretty much here to stay.
Thank you for sharing that insight. So we have another question from the Feed Loop chat. Where does the Ministry of Labor, Immigration, Training and Skills Development Newcomer Settlement Program fit into this strategy?
Well, where it fits in the strategy is basically identifying how provincial, is the question about the settlement aspect or about the ministry as a whole?
I would say probably the settlement program.
Okay. So on the settlement program front, I touched on this in my remarks, seeing how provincial government can complement federally funded settlement programs and services so that we can address gaps. So actually, Ontario spends the most out of any province and territory on settlements. It's about 110 million-ish a year. Obviously, we welcome the most immigrants. And this is a decent sized amount of money to address the main gap, which I believe are the temporary residents who aren't eligible for IRCC funded services. It's a great pool of individuals who can support newcomer retention in Eastern Ontario. So we're able to use those resources to provide the settlement supports that temporary residents need with respect to language training, with respect to employment integration. That can be a great complement to what we're doing with IRCC funded settlement programs.
So a simple question from the Q&A window. What is IRS?
I don't know what that is.
Okay. Okay, we will put a pin in that.
Did I speak to IRS on my presentation?
No, I don't believe so.
Can they elaborate on what they mean by IRS, and then maybe we can take a stab at the question? Maybe we can do that in a moment.
Maybe we can do that in a moment. We'll give that person time to elaborate a little bit. So a comment from our Q&A. So I would say that the biggest challenge would be retention. Toronto offers a very diverse community where newcomers to not feel left out. So an average newcomer looks to come to Canada to get work and grow. Toronto seems to offer newcomers an opportunity without prior work experience in Canada. However, the Eastern Ontario cities seem to still be reluctant to ease up on this barrier. Newcomers end up doing survival jobs for a long time and then move back to Toronto. This cycle seems to happen over and over again. Any thoughts on that comment?
Yeah, sure. It's a well-founded comment for sure. I would say a couple of things. First, developing that initial critical mass of newcomers is absolutely key, and it's the hardest. However, again, we've seen the formula for success across Canada. So like provinces like Manitoba and Saskatchewan, they didn't develop they weren't born with a critical mass, right? Like in the mid 1990s, most immigrants, again, were going to the three big provinces. They went out, they recruited, they focused on certain community groups or certain ethnic groups who were then able to spread the word, and they were able to support chain migration. And then over time, they developed a stronger and larger economy, and they were able to diversify their immigrant recruitment efforts. So initially, it's very hard, but there is a formula for success out there. The other thing I'll point out, and sometimes smaller jurisdictions don't like hearing this, but I think it is notable to observe, is that the definition or the benchmark for retention varies by the size of your community. So if you're a large community or a large city like Toronto, you're looking to retain the newcomer in perpetuity. Whereas if you're a smaller or medium-sized community, there's still a benefit to attracting immigrants for a small window of time, even if it's 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, because during that period, they're benefiting the local economy in a variety of ways, both as employees as well as through their consumption of goods and services, right? So all is not lost if a smaller community brings in newcomers and then after a few years they leave, right? Obviously you want to keep them for as long as possible, but you're still able to benefit in that short period of time.
So our next question is in relation to your information sharing on the provincial nominee program. So we recently heard about a province that has started to provide nominations to immigrants from certain countries, predominantly European and a few others. Do you think that this will be the future of this kind of selection? Is this an example of where provinces might be taking too many liberties with the provincial nominee program?
Yeah, so they're talking about Saskatchewan. They're being diplomatic and not naming them. I'll name them. I think this story is completely overblown, and I'll explain why. So essentially, as the question alludes, Saskatchewan, I believe, in August or September, they began nominating people based on their country of origin. It's not that simple. You still have to meet the criteria of their immigrant nominee program. However, what they were saying is, if you meet the criteria and you're from these countries, we'll provide you with an invitation. The provincial nominee programs have always been doing this in a less direct way. What the provinces often do, including here in Ontario, is they engage in overseas recruitment missions. And guess what? These missions are in one country at a time, right? They'll go to a country, they'll say, hey, we offer this provincial nominee program. Why don't you immigrate here? Start applying, right? And they choose these provinces, or sorry, these countries based on their analysis that by targeting these countries, they're going to be able to successfully attract and retain more immigrants, right? So I don't see anything inherently wrong with what Saskatchewan is doing. Again, tying it back to the previous question on retention, Saskatchewan has conducted an analysis. It feels that by targeting these countries, they're going to be able to support retention. And by the way, this effort isn't noted when there's a very positive impact. So Saskatchewan, as well as Manitoba, over the last year, since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, have said we're holding dedicated draws to bring more Ukrainians to our provinces, which is obviously a good thing.
So I think we'll use this as our last question as we approach time. So we recently saw the incredible disconnect between the federal government and municipal needs as pertains to asylum seekers. We saw this in Eastern Ontario and Cornwall and other areas that were overburdened, receiving populations coming through Roxham. And we saw it in Toronto recently, where the municipality stood up to the feds and forced housing support. You mentioned that municipalities need to be brought more firmly into the immigration and settlement. But these recent occurrences shine light on just how far apart municipal realities are from federal supports. How should municipalities proceed? How do they focus, and on what?
I would say it's very important for municipalities to continue to knock on Ottawa's door to highlight that they play a vital role in terms of newcomers, and they are significantly impacted by federal decision-making. They need to remind the federal government that they must be consulted on immigration decisions, big and small, and that the lack of consultation will inevitably end up in all of us paying the price, as we're seeing with the asylum issue and the amount of money that the federal government has had to pass over to municipalities to be able to address the asylum issue. I actually hosted an event prior to the pandemic with the former mayor of Calgary, Naheed Nenshi, and he said something that I'll never forget, and perhaps it's something that the municipalities can reiterate to the federal government when it comes to immigration. He said, if the federal government was to disappear from your life, probably take you a year to realize it. If the provincial government disappeared from your life, it'd probably take you a month. And if the municipal government disappeared from your life, you'd be dead, right? So it goes to show you just how important municipalities are in our immigration system today. And again, the Constitution is not an excuse. The federal government as well as the provinces, they play a big role in this as well. They have to have a formal seat at the table for municipalities when it comes to immigration.
So some really wonderful questions, and I'm sad to say that we can't get to all of the questions, but I appreciate everybody's engagement with the Q&A portion of our time with Kareem. And so before we close our keynote session, I want to thank you, Kareem, for your time and your outstanding talk. For our attendees, we now have a 15-minute break before our first set of workshops today, where you'll find that there are 3 dynamic sessions to choose from. There will be live interpretation available for each workshop. So if you are, depending on the language that the session is being delivered in, you have options to ensure that you can fully engage. So again, thank you, everybody. Merci, miigwech.